Okay, well, it is 1 o'clock. I'm going to get started here. It looks like we have a great diversity of people from all over the states. We even have some folks joining us from Canada, so I just want to welcome you all to the webinar today. Like I said earlier, some of you might have missed it. My name is Carrie Berger, and I'm the coordinator for the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. The consortium is part of a 15-member collaborative network of fire science exchanges that are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. Each exchange is working to communicate fire science within their regions and working across regions to share best practices. To learn more about the Northwest Fire Science Consortium and the Exchange Network, visit our webpage at northwestfirescience.org. So to avoid any noise interference, I have muted your audio and also your video here. So if you have any questions, please type that into the chat box. And if you're not familiar with Zoom, you can find your chat box on the lower part of your computer screen. Just hover over that bar and the chat box should be one of the bubbles that you can select. I'll also be recording this webinar and we'll archive it on our website and YouTube channel. And you can find both those web addresses in the chat window, which is now, since we've had a lot of folks chiming in here, I'll post that again so it's fresh in the chat box. I'd like to first introduce Brad Washaw. Brad is the Assistant Fire Director for Integration with the BLM and Forest Service. And Brad's going to be helping me out to moderate the question portion of the webinar. So then, without further ado, it is my complete pleasure to introduce Stephen Pyne. Steve is an emeritus professor at Arizona State University and the author of numerous books on fire, and most recently, Between Two Fires, A Fire History of Contemporary America and To the Last Smoke, a 9-book series that surveys the American fire scene by region. So we're super excited to have you online with us today, Steve. Whenever you're ready, I also just want to make a quick reminder to the audience, please do keep your audio muted so that we can all hear Steve without any interruptions. So go ahead, Steve.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, and thanks, Brad and Carrie, for the invitation and the opportunity. Where to begin? Let's start, why green on black? I take as a text a passage from John Muir. He wrote at Puget Sound around 1912. And he talks about coming up the slopes of the mountains. They have no trees older than 50 years, many much younger, and they all show plainly that they've been burned. And then he explores a little further and he finds that there are other trees 100, 200 years old, the same record. And then I accented it, though heavily veiled with mosses and lichens. And in many ways, the fabled wetness of the Northwest, its greenery, has covered some of its fire story, I think. So let me see if we can uncover a bit of that as I go along. So a 2-minute briefing on where this comes from. I began a project about 8 years ago. It was a 2-book project. One would be Between Two Fires. That was a narrative. I regarded it as a kind of play-by-play, but I also wanted a second book that I thought of as a kind of color commentary that would get some of the details and get it, burrow a bit into the pixels and polygons. And that sort of took off and began self-organizing into a suite of regional studies. And that will now be anthologized, or at least selections from all that, in a book coming out this spring. So I finally got back to the 2-book conception, but in the meantime, there were 9 other books. We put a maximum of 55, 60,000 words, so none of them are too big. So the Northwest falls into a book called Slopovers, which, as the name suggests, got to be a little bigger. And that's because it has 3, what I regarded as mini surveys. The idea for a mini survey actually began with the Great Plains book, What to Do with Texas? Yeah, what to do with Texas? An existential question. And I couldn't put Texas into the Plains story easily, so I wound up doing a mini version, a miniaturized version. And then that gave me the idea that I could do that with some other regions that I didn't have the time or money to pursue at full length. So the Oak Woodlands, Mid-America area, the Alaska, and Pacific Northwest falls into that. So yes, the Pacific Northwest gets a bit shortchanged. And in reality, it's actually a bit worse because one of the reviewers of the California book told the press, okay, but I needed to do more with Northern California, and I agreed I'd put that in the Pacific Northwest, not thinking it would be a miniature version. So yeah, you got shortchanged. But let me see if I can still identify the main themes. Now, I go at this basically as a historian. So let me think about how I would see the sort of characteristic traits, the tells, if you will, for the region, and then how I would think about it in the national narrative. So I think there are a couple defining dialectics, if you will. Natural geography, fire and water. Well, that's true for fire everywhere, but it seems exaggerated in the Northwest, both seasonally and geographically. And then the human geography, it's really about fire and axe. Cutting has always been the other part of the fire story, and we'll see how that plays out. The place in the national narrative, very interesting. Of course, it has fire history all through continually, even well beyond the national story. But the mid-20th century, the timber industry and fire protection combined to really make the region an outstanding and informative one for the country overall. And I would frame that particular narrative by two timber wars, and I'll explain what those mean later. Well, there's lots of indigenous fire. The Willamette Valley is really one of the great case studies, one of the best understood reconstructions of what a landscape was like in pre-contact periods, and continues to be a source of information. And that has expanded some interesting studies on the east side of the Cascade, the Blue Mountains, and somewhat surprisingly into the Coast Range. Nobody had expected that, but we're finding more stuff. And this seems to be a case of you find what you look for. And if you think there is no story there, you don't look. If you think maybe there is a story, then you tend to find it. So I would expect we're going to see a lot more of this. And this comes back in very recent times as part of the political dynamic of fire, the recovery, if you will, of cultural burning. I think it is and will become in the future an even greater part of the regional fire story. Settlement, the whole movement across the United States, 19th, early 20, even into the early 20th century was just one wave of fire. Okay, it was a broken wave, but it was more or less continuous. We literally slashed and burned our way across. Oregon, in particular, 1840s, as soon as people begin settling, the fires start up, or at least we have good records of large fires, and then they continue. 1868, probably the last big outbreak, but they're all through. And most of these require not only a bit of drought and some east winds, they require a lot of slash. And in the 19th century, even when we're in the tail end of the Little Ice Age, how are we getting these megafires? We're getting them because the performance enhancer is all the stuff left after the axe. So axe and fire were considered sort of the twin evils. And early conservation movement was an attempt to regulate both. And of course, you get wonderful photos that could be used for publicity, and were. Many of these were, this one was taken by the early Forest Service to illustrate the havoc. So to set that into a larger setting, the 1880 census gave us a map of forest fires. So it doesn't include desert fires, it doesn't include a lot of grassland fires, doesn't do much where there isn't much settlement because there was nobody to report, but this is sort of what the geography looked like. And you can see the entire West Coast above Southern California is pretty well represented. And almost all of this is disturbed land. This is land that's been cut or overturned by mining or in some other way disturbed in a fashion that really contributes to very large fires. So it's present, but it's not. Actually, the Lake states were of more interest in 1880, and the Northeast. Well, look at Pennsylvania. We're having 600,000, a million acres burning in Pennsylvania annually. So the Northwest was not particularly significant. This was the backdrop, really bad burns, hundreds of people killed, landscapes pretty well trashed. And this was a background for the state, an argument for the state, meaning government of some form, to intervene. And it was really a global project. The United States didn't invent concept of conservation or state-sponsored conservation. It was all through the European imperium. British India was one of the source areas and a constant model. The Pacific Northwest certainly contributed to this, and we could see scenes like this. So, but it was all part of the general stew, if you will, of big and frequently abusive burns. So it wasn't clear if you were going to intervene, who is going to do it and how. But the project, again, on the European model, was to create reserves, beginning our forest reserves. Parks were a somewhat different model, but certainly a smaller scale model. But forest reserves was the primary method. And perhaps just by name, it ended up with foresters, which was not an obvious choice, by the way. So here's Gifford Pinchot, 1898, head of the Bureau of Forestry, arguing that, like the question of slavery, question of forest fires may be shelved for some time at enormous cost in the end, but sooner or later it must be met. Really? We're equating fire protection with abolitionism. Pinchot, by the way, was writing that. He was studying southern New Jersey, area we don't think today, being primarily a fire. Then on his primer on forestry, of all the foes, none is so terrible as fire. So foresters came to fire really hating and fearing it. Central Europe had no real background in fire, in understanding it. The science of the day was completely inadequate and in many ways antagonistic and unhelpful and actually an impediment to making progress. But that's what we had, and that's what we worked with. So in 1905, U.S. Forest Service is renamed. It gets control over the forest reserves, transferred from the Interior Department. It had already established fire as a visible index of havoc and success. 1907, Roosevelt doubles the size of the forest reserves. It could be done by presidential proclamation. 1908, they get an emergency fire fund. So the whole apparatus is underway. The lower right, both these photos, by the way, landscape photos, are both from the Northwest. And the region is in many ways caught between two eras. One is this kind of laissez-faire capitalism, the cut out and get out philosophy that, as Roosevelt put it, was scalping the land and then burning it. And a more modern, more contemporary, that is, environmentalist approach to be interested in preservation, many forms. Pacific Northwest will really fall with particular force in that middle era, the time of conservation. So the first timber war, what was that? Well, people were naturally alarmed at what they saw. The National Academy of Sciences was called on in 1896 to survey the new system of reserves and to make recommendations. They wrote that for 6 weeks through 6 Western states, they were never out of the sight of smoke. And it seemed clear to them that this combination of fire and axe would have to be regulated in some form. They actually suggested teaching forestry at West Point and turning the job over to the Army at one point. We didn't. We found a civilian equivalent, but they also suggested British India was a potential model. So big fires frame the debate. The 1902 fires, the occult fires, Columbia fires, lots of different names, didn't get much national traction. 1910, of course, did. And in between, we have a variety of efforts to control fire, which are not limited to the federal government. There was a strong push among some of the federal foresters to simply nationalize forestry, that the problems were so acute, the industry was so hopelessly committed to overcutting for its own economic subsistence, that it would be better to nationalize land. That wasn't going to happen, but the threat of government intervention, government regulation, sparked interest among the large timber owners in creating private associations, timber protective associations, what became known as the Idaho idea. Southern Idaho was one of the first to take it on. Then in 1909, the Western Forestry and Conservation Association, a major event at the time, brought together, acted as a kind of umbrella group to bring together many of these private associations and then form alliances with others, including the state and federal government. And then after the big blow up, the Weeks Act creates the matrix for a federal state cooperation, and then that's reinforced by and magnified by the Clark-McNary Act and so forth. So what we have is an era where the various interests in forests and fire come together and begin finding ways to cooperate. In many ways, this was a remarkable achievement because otherwise they were at one another's throats, threatening dire consequences. William Greeley was a major figure in this. He regarded cooperative forestry, particularly fire protection, as one of his signal achievements during his tenure as chief forester during the 1920s. Greeley, I always want to like Greeley. In many ways, he's a likable guy, and he really distinguished himself, I think, during the 1910 fires. I mean, he was, I think, 29 years old, in charge of the entire Northern Rockies region, had to deal with it, and I think did remarkably well. But he was also a creature of his time, and this is an era where, as President Coolidge put it, the business of America is business. And so Greeley resigns, becomes executive secretary of the West Coast Lumbermen's Association. So we see here, again, an interesting form of cooperation or co-opting, perhaps. And firewood was the means that brought them together. It was the shared threat that allowed them to find some way to come together. And one of my favorite photos from the era, Greeley was a great advocate of every fire needs to be tackled. This is actually from the Olympic National Forest, and the top of that tree has been blasted out by lightning. There's some rot and it's smoldering. And so these guys went out, they were going to put out the fire. So how to get it? They toppled that tree that's leaning into the top. They cut it down, and then one guy scooted up to the top. And then he's lowering a bucket, which a guy below is filling with water. And they're using this to put out. And they were proud of this. They took a photo of it. It's in the National Archives. And not recommended practice today, but we can certainly admire them for their commitment. And I think it does illustrate the extent to which this really was a program to which people were willing to commit significant effort. Okay. Then the cycle during this mid-period, the mid-20s, the mid-20th century, when fire and axe come together in a cooperative way, and really the Pacific Northwest comes to exert a special influence nationally. It's really defined, I think, by the Tillamook burn cycle. It dominates all the other stories, and it reburned every 6 years through 1951. There was a massive salvage operation that was underway. The Civilian Conservation Corps was sent out to fire lines for the first time in force for the initial Tillamook fire. They spent a lot of time cutting field breaks, felling snags, putting in roads, doing lots of stuff into the Tillamook area. And the CCC, in other ways, in the 1934, a year later, was sent to the Selway fires in the Northern Rockies, reburning or cleaning out stuff that had been missed in the 1910 fires. At this point, Chief Forester Gus Silcox thinks he's got the resources to finally take on fire once and for all, and he announces a 10 a.m. policy in 1935. So the example of the CCC, I think, in the Northwest was important, although most of the CCC labor really reached extravagant proportions on fire in California. World War II, fire war, new fire weapons, fire defined as hostile fire, fire as enemy fire, publicity campaigns, and a reserves force was created by the Forest Service along the West Coast in anticipation of possible incendiary attacks by Japan. And this is an example of training operation outside Portland, showing the latest in personal protective gear, but they were committed in the sense, again, a common cause of fire. Out of the war came fire prevention poster, first rather hardcore, then Bambi, then Smokey Bear, and then a living Smokey Bear. But industry also created its alternative, Keep America Green, particularly interested fire in forest plantations and areas, timber birthing, if you will, and that continues. So the region again found a way to play into the national story with its own particular accent. So in the meantime, in the 1960s and 70s, what I think of as a fire revolution boiled over. Bicoastal, one node in Florida, really interested in working landscapes, prescribed fire, very influential for a number of agencies, and a California model which was really interested in wild landscapes and public lands, wanted to restore natural fire, and that had its own history as well. Now, the two were not the same. They were both united against this, what they regarded as a mindless fire suppression operation and a hegemony on fire that was run by the Forest Service. So there was an institutional objection and there was a kind of ideological objection. And that sets into motion changes in fire policy. The Park Service renounces the 10 a.m. policy in 1968, the Forest Service 10 years later. It's worth remembering, this is 40, 50 years ago. These are not new issues. So in the Northwest, the major figure for the revolution was a guy named Harold Weaver. And here he is in a shot. That's Herbert Stoddard in the center, sort of the mastermind behind the Tall Timbers project in Florida. That's Harold Biswell to the right in California, and then Weaver. And Weaver was interesting because he became an advocate for prescribed burning, particularly in ponderosa pine forests, montane forests generally. He'd grown up in the Northwest. He was born in the Blue Mountains at a hydraulic mining camp, went to forestry school, then had a long career with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, several agencies in the Northwest, achieved kind of special notoriety in Arizona at the White Mountain Apache Agency for promoting it. And of course, he's often celebrated that here we have this figure who's promoting it, and it turns out he's publishing in the Journal of Forestry, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs is writing disclaimers that his views are not those of the official agency. And so he's brought into this triumvirate, to this small group. We could add the Comarcs and a few others. But Weaver was really different, and different in a way in keeping with what I see as the Northwest character. All the rest were wildlife people, basically. They were interested in habitat. They were interested in what fire exclusion was doing to lots of species and things that interested them. Weaver was a forester. He was a credentialed forester. He served as a forester. He was a bureaucratic forester. He published in the Journal of Forestry. Yeah, they wrote criticisms of him, but they published him. They wouldn't have published the others. He had a degree of credence and access that the others did not. And again, that goes back to his forestry background. And he was interested in fire as a way of advancing silviculture. So that made it in a way acceptable to the region. Also, the other event I would note, the 1970 fire season, I think, was the Forest Service's last hurrah as a kind of hegemon. Big fires in California, the Wenatchee fires in Washington, really the last time it could pretend to go alone. And so the revolution in many forms is underway. In the Northwest, the fire issue, as so many things, tends to be split east and west. James Agee had a wonderful description of the fire problems. On the east side, we were taking out fires that needed to be there. On the west side, we're putting in fires, mainly in logging slash, probably didn't need to be there. And different problems, different needs, east and west. But again, it was defined in terms of the timber industry. And lumping both of these kinds of burning under a common name, prescribed fire, when prescribed fire at the time was intended to enhance sort of progressive environmental thinking about restoring ecological goods and services, about enhancing, was in some ways a slick move, and in some ways an unfortunate one, because for many people, much of the public, lumping them all together means that the east side restored fire gets put into the same barrel as the west side slash fires. So increasingly, the Northwest is going to be on the wrong side of these changes. And it's amazing how much stuff was written, particularly in the 70s, about fuel management and fire. But when you parse it, 90% of it is about what to do with slash. And most of that was in the Northwest, and some spillover into the Northern Rockies, of course, California. Excuse me. Well, the second timber war. This time there's going to be a quarrel, and the Endangered Species Act is going to be the pivotal fulcrum, and culminating eventually in the Northwest Forest Plan, which declared a kind of truce, but I don't think the war ended. By now it had become a cultural war, and complicated by identity politics and all kinds of stuff that is very tricky to deal with. The Northwest comes back in one form in this, though the Blue Mountains become a kind of poster child for the forest health issue. And a series of books are written on fire in the Pacific Northwest, I think from 89 to 93, coinciding with the same thing, which summarize it in ways that I don't think any other region really had a consolidated summary of this. So at this point, it comes back in a different way, but it doesn't seem to have traction on the ground. And cooperative fire protection comes back in a new form. This time, most of these are national. So we've got fire suppression with BIFC, the NIFC, National Wildfire Coordinating Group, mostly among the feds, common fed policy, but we've also got a joint fire science program. And with the national cohesive strategy, we begin involving all these other groups that had not been part of the national infrastructure. Really, what do you do with a lot of counties and fire districts, volunteer fire departments? What do you do with all these kinds of state operations, which have very different charters than the feds? How do we bring all of this together? We don't really have a good mechanism, but we're gradually working it out in interesting ways. And one of the interesting things for me is the emergence of what I think of as a civil society for fire. That is non-governmental organizations. The Nature Conservancy, not only a big, a monstrous presence environmentally, but a major player in fire. The Nature Conservancy burns as much or more each year as the National Park Service, and the NPS does 75, 80% of that in 2 parks in Florida. The growth of prescribed fire councils, non-governmental. Also, the emergence of tribal interest in fire, and an enthusiasm for restoring fire, not just for ecological reasons or for what it might do for silviculture, but for cultural concerns. And I think this is really a very interesting destabilizing element in a helpful way, because it prevents, where this works, it prevents the kind of dichotomy and polarization that we see in many places. This was very interesting in Alaska to see what the Native Claims Act did, how that introduced a third party, which forced the others to come to an agreement that they wouldn't have managed on their own. This is happening at a really large scale in Australia right now. It's quite fascinating. And the emergence of what critics are calling a fire industrial complex, fire suppression. We began privatizing it in a large way during the Reagan administration. I don't see any evidence personally that it's reduced any costs. In fact, we've created a lobbying group now with a vested interest in having the federal government spend money on suppression. But this is becoming a major presence. Maybe some of you can correct me, but I think reading last year, some of the summaries on fires in the Northwest, as much as a third of the crews or engines were actually private sources. This is neither good nor bad, but it is an interesting development, and it shifts the character of the debate. But what I also find interesting is that in the first timber war, when cooperative fire protection emerged, industry was a committed part. And had the timber industry not joined at force, even if it was under threat, had it not participated, that program could not have happened. And what seems to be missing now in my brief surveys of the Northwest is that industry is not a part of the solution in the way it was in the first timber war. Instead, it is sort of moved into the suppression side. And yes, we have some, consultants and prescribed fire assistance and so forth, but really industry has not been a part of that. And yes, there are things industry can be brought in to help do some work, but industry isn't paying for it in the way that they paid after the first timber war. So Pacific Northwest really kind of vanished for a few decades from the national scene, except as a part of the forest health issue. And then it's really stormed back in the last 5 years or so. A whole new cycle of conflagrations has emerged. I don't need to tell most of you, there are maps, satellite photos, it's all over the place. Suddenly it is a major disturbance in the force nationally. And there's a lot more public engagement than there has been, partly by flame and the threat it poses to treasured sites and actually communities, and not less by smoke. You can't escape. Fire is coming back. So that suggests there's going to be more political engagement as well. Historically, the Northwest was important primarily through Senator McNary, who authored some of the key legislation that made cooperative fire possible. Today, probably the only two congressional figures I'm aware of, certainly in the Senate, who have done anything with fire, have taken any serious notice of it, are Senators Cantwell and Wyden from Washington and Oregon, respectively. So there's a political engagement. The whole region is sort of reconnecting in very interesting ways. We'll have to see what happens out of it. So very quickly summarized, let's look at three kinds of fires that characterize the eras. One, we have a settlement era, those great wave of conflagrations, roughly, let's just give it a rough 5-year average between outbreaks. Industrial era, where fire and axe combine, and cooperative fire protection under the banner of conservation takes place, best symbolized by the Tillamook barn. It's 6-year cycle, progressive cleaning out. One of the massive salvage operation went on for years, and then replanting. And now the Tillamook forest is being reharvested. So this was taken as one of the founding sagas, if you will, of American forestry, one of the great success stories. But now we're into a kind of environmental era, and let's look at the fires in the southwestern part of Oregon. eerily occurring now on a 15-year cycle. And compare the response to these different eras. The settlement era, there was nothing you could do but sort of flee. One reason fires got so big so fast is that people would run back to their patch of country and burn out. They light backfires around their place if they had some time. And so this becomes a new form of long-range spotting, and fires can really scale up in a hurry. During the industrial era, very concentrated working of trying to deal with slash, burn slash, focus on fire control. It turns out it was overly done and done in places where it wasn't really appropriate. But nonetheless, there was a concerted effort, and a lot of firepower could be brought to bear, particularly with the CCC and then the post-war war surplus equipment that was transferred over to fire protection. Environmental era, very different. It's also difficult to find a clear narrative. It's a pretty clear narrative in settlement. It's a pretty clear narrative with Tillamook and its variety of fires. Environmental era is very complicated. A lot of arguments over what it means. A lot of competing narratives. A lot of different interpretations. The only thing people can agree on is that most of them don't like it. It's too expensive. It's too cumbersome. It doesn't do what they particularly would like to do. If compromise is defined as something that none of the parties likes, it's a good compromise, but a compromise has to work. And it seems to me, viewing this from afar, that there's still a lot of work yet to be done. And again, what I don't see, even on some of the large-scale restoration projects, it seems we can get the axe in, but the fire is a lot tougher. And in many ways, it's the fire we really need. So it'll be interesting to see how this continues to play out and what the politics behind it would be. Anyway, to return to Muir's comment today, I think we have an environmental movement that in some ways covers the fire history with a green philosophy. But if we look through the forest, again, as Muir invited us, we continue to see lots of evidence of fire over a large scale across a long era into what may become a future fire age. In fact, I'm toying with the idea that the scale of our combustion habits, the things we are doing with fire, are such that we may be creating a fire age comparable to the ice ages of the Pleistocene, or what I like to call the Pyrocene. So this will be a topic for future development. So who knows what will happen in the coming era. So with that, hey, there's some contact information. And I'd be happy to take questions now. So I think I need to stop sharing. Is that right?
No, you're okay for now, Steve.
Okay.
Just fascinating. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate all the information that you've provided us and your insight. I'd like to open it up for questions at this point. So if you have a question for Steve, go ahead. Now's your chance. Type it into the chat box. Again, you can find the chat bubble in the lower portion of your screen. If you just hover in that lower portion, a bar should pop up, and there's a little chat bubble that you can type your question in. So let's just give folks just a minute or two here to think of questions. And
so with that, I do appreciate Steve's bringing to light fire, both in the historical context and bringing a cultural connection to that and wildfires. So if we don't have any questions, I've come up with a couple questions, and Steve and I have collaborated a couple times on a couple things, including these webinars, and always really enjoy that. So the other week, Steve, someone used a quote that basically went to the fact that the chief cause of our problems today are the solutions of yesteryear's problems. And I'm wondering if you would agree with that. And with that, how can you take the statement and project it forward in what we're doing in the Pacific Northwest?
Wow, that's a really astute comment. And actually it has a long, not surprising, it has a long history. I mean, that is basically the historical dialectic, if you're interested in Hegel or even Marx, that out of the contradictions of one period, are, as they synthesize, that creates the new contradiction. But I think, and this is one of the values of history. We think, why did these people do such dumb things? And because we compare what they did to what our needs today are. And in some ways we need, if you want to understand it, you have to realize what was their problem? And let's be clear, in the late 19th century, there were a lot of bad fires out there. And they were doing a lot of damage. We're talking about megafires an order of magnitude larger than what we've seen in the last couple of decades, and an order of magnitude larger in fatalities than what we've seen. So they were responding, and they used the tools they had. By our standards, they weren't adequate. They stayed with them too long because, well, they understood them. And to their mind, it had worked. They just didn't realize that fixing fire is not like fixing a Bunsen burner or something. Nature changes, and fire will integrate those changes. So many of the things that they were most proud of, the recovery of forest, these thick stands of undergrowth, the forest of the future, they thought of it. Now we think of it, wow, these are, whole landscapes of ladder fields waiting to combust. Those at the time were taken as success compared with what they had. So we might also show a little humility toward our own situation, and what we think are the solutions we're working for now are very likely going to be seen as problematic later. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do them, but we should always be sort of prudent and humble about what we're able to do. I titled the narrative book Between Two Fires because I don't see a final endpoint. We're always going to be between two fires. They may change, but we're always going to have to walk between them. And so, yeah, good point. There's no single solution for this. This is not something that's derived from first principles of physics. This is not something you can get by studying chemistry and applying some math. These are complicated historical evolutionary systems. And in some ways, we made an unfortunate turn by going with fire behavior as the foundation of our fire science rather than fire ecology. But that's the reality, and we have to go with what we've got.
Well, appreciate that. So we're starting to get some questions coming in on the chat. Celeste asks, could you say more about what you mean by a future fire age, good fire or bad fire?
Okay, actually on my website there, I've got some articles posted, and I've got a larger one coming up towards the end of this month in Eon magazine. Fire age, I just think start adding up. And by our fire practices, I don't just mean in living landscapes, I mean our lithic landscapes as well, and the way those two interact. And lithic landscapes refer to all the living landscapes that lithified and are now fossil biomass, and we're burning as fossil fuels. So if you start adding up all of those, we've got changes in sea level, we have mass extinctions, we have whole-scale reconstructions of biotas and shifts and migrations. Wow, that looks a lot like the Ice Age, except with fire. So that doesn't mean fire is just going to sit and burn the way an ice sheet sits there for thousands of years, but it does mean that the landscape will be informed or shaped by fire. And I don't think many people appreciate the pervasiveness of fire. And we could also add lots of the secondary effects, the periglacial, if you will, or the equivalent, in terms of smoke and knock-on effects for social, economic effects, and so forth. It just goes on and on. So it's a way of making vivid what that future may be. You say Anthropocene, or people argue over climate change. They don't quite know what it means. And for me, climate history has become a subset of fire history. I mean, that's what's perturbing the climate. So let's make fire the informing principle of this narrative, and then let's try to give it a crisp sort of analog. And a kind of fire age does that. So I don't believe we have a no analog or no narrative future. We have both if we look to fire.
Okay, that makes some sense. Another question is, And I know in your book you cover it, especially when you're talking about the Willamette Valley and a little bit on the Blues, but could you speak to the fire regimes in the Pacific Northwest prior to the 1840s?
Well, I'm not sure we have all the information we need to do that to the extent we would like. The Willamette Valley seems to be best, and it was very much a cultural landscape, intensely manipulated with fire as a catalyst. And it's hard to imagine, since so much of the burning occurred in the late fall, that some fraction of those fires didn't catch the east winds and blow into and across the coast ranges as well. But I'm not sure. I don't have the information for that. A lot of the Blue Mountains, and east side, a lot of the same story we have in montane forests throughout the American West. I don't see a significant difference. Some interest, some shift because of the introduction of the horse into the Blues and some of the other areas of the Great Basin. One of the interesting things in the Willamette area that makes, in many ways, it reminds me of Tallgrass Prairie. I mean, people were coming from Tallgrass Prairie and they went to the Willamette Valley, which had much the same. It was not that different away from Missouri or some of these other sites. The big difference was the absence of really large ungulates. I mean, just herds of bison or the equivalent. And so the dynamic is a little different. It would be interesting to see that parse out. I don't know. And I don't know I suspect if we looked for more fire and more big fire in the coast ranges and the rest, we will find it. Where that evidence is coming from, I don't know. And in some ways, we're back to the no analog future. If we have really aggressive climate change and all the other things that we've set into motion, what is the value of looking at that past? Well, some of it is we can try to save and recover some for future generations. But a lot of the lessons of history in this are not technical and they're not data. They're about character. I mean, they're really, how do you live in a contingent, an uncertain world about which we have incomplete knowledge? How do you behave? What mixture of boldness and prudence is appropriate? So I think the real lessons are in those studies, and it would be nice to have more biographies of fire people and see what they've done.
Okay.
Probably not a satisfactory answer. I think it's the best I can give you now.
Well, that works.
Okay.
I know there's a couple questions about the Biscuit complex, along with what happened leading up to that with Chetco Bar afterwards and the Silver Fire. And also, we also talk about the Tillamook fires, that was like 6-year cycles. Biscuit's been 15. What do you think led to the ending of the Tillamook fire occurrence cycle? And then where do you see that going with the Biscuit or the Southwest Oregon complex situation? And has logging influenced that? And what impacted the suppression strategies take, like with Biscuit fire and that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Let me go back to Tillamook. I think it's fairly clear on Tillamook, and part of the attraction of that is that it's a confined world. You know when it starts and when it ends and what was done in between. So there's a nice narrative arc to it. And it kept reburning at the same time. They were hauling out stuff as much as they could. A massive salvage operation that went on for 10 years or more. At the same time, the CCC was putting in fuel breaks, they're putting in roads, and then eventually the fire scene is controlled enough because there's not much left to burn that you can begin planting a forest. And at this point, you have a kind of infrastructure to provide fire control and keep that plantation forest from burning until it matures. That's not a model, I think, that's going to apply in the Southwest of Oregon and the Klamath-Siskiyou Mountains. I don't see that happening. It can work in select areas, but people find some success story, and then they generalize. Hey, it worked in my backyard. It can work in yours. Floridians say, hey, all you have to do is just decide to burn, and you burn. Well, it's almost impossible to overburn in Florida. I mean, the historic saying was that Florida burned twice a year, and it did. In one year burned 115%, according to the state forester, because people would burn the same area twice. But you can't apply that same technique in California. The circumstances are different. The cultural it doesn't. It's got to be something different. So and I think we have to. I'm willing to accept the failure of the Florida model, that kind of prescribed burning, as a generic technique throughout the West. It just isn't doing it. It can't be done at scale. It's too encumbered. It's too complicated. Instead, what we're doing is managing wildfires, and we're getting the acres. And I think we could do that better. We could be smarter about it. This is a kind of hybrid fire. It's part suppression, part prescribed fire done under urgent conditions, not emergency burnouts, but a kind of hasty, yet thoughtful prescribed fire. And that seems to be where the future is going to be. So I'm not sure how the politics and cultural politics in the Klamath-Siskiyou area is going to play out. But my best guess is that some kind of managed wildfire is going to be the only solution. Getting that in place, getting that recurring. Although I don't see it happening in the Northwest. You just don't have successes without including the X. So I think there should be a space for some kind of cutting, and what kind of prescribed cutting might go along with some kind of prescribed burning to create the conditions for these sort of managed wildfires or box and burn or whatever we end up calling them. We probably won't have a name until a new technique has come into vogue. But I think some combination of that will probably be necessary to move forward.
As long as we're in the southwest of Oregon, I know in the book you had a section on what they're doing in the Ashland watershed, and you identified the Ashland Forest Resiliency Project as kind of a model for other communities to adapt, yet the pace and scale of it has never really gotten to a level where it probably needs to be a success.
Yeah. I was deeply impressed with what people were doing there and the depth of their commitment and the longevity and tenacity of their commitment. But I was also appalled by the amount of social capital that requires. And I can't, in some ways Ashland itself is protected because the main problem is on the west side, and the most dangerous winds are going to be from the east. So it's going to blow away. But the watershed is critical, other stuff. I was just astonished at how difficult it has been, and also the limits of kind of voluntary efforts. And again, what I thought was missing, they've got some thinning operations going on in the watershed. They're doing some stuff. It's really hard. They're getting some things done. But at scale, the only way to do that would be if industry was signed up, was on board. And in the first timber war, they were. Weyerhaeuser, the executive director for Weyerhaeuser, George Long, said, well, we're going to decide what the right thing to do is, and we're going to do it. And that was determined to be fire control. And industry got on board. In this case, I don't see that. I don't have a magic solution to get industry involved. But other than that, I don't see how you're going to get it done at scale. And you have to make sure that after the cutting, it gets burned, because repeatedly I see, not just in the Northwest, but it seems especially in the Northwest, that it's easy to log. You see this in BC as well. It's easy to log, and then the stuff that's supposed to follow the logging somehow gets overlooked. And one of the real lapses in my too brief survey of the Northwest was large parts of Washington. I just ran out of time and money and space. So that's there for someone else to do. And you're not alone. The Lake State's got one essay in a collection of pieces on the Northeast. So
I think that kind of leads nicely into the next question, as far as, do you think because of risk aversion amongst the land management agencies that a push for more prescribed burning, a push for more prescribed burning would ultimately come from tribal interest or in continuation with cultural burning or from other private entities, TNC, prescribed fire councils, et cetera?
Well, I think it's the tribal and the NGOs who are going to carry most prescribed fire outside of slash burning and some. And I think the federal agencies are going increasingly to go to a mixed model where they manage wildfires. And I mean, they'll put all their resources where they should, protecting communities and municipal watersheds and really high value assets, but otherwise take advantage of these and begin expanding the range of their burning. And all that burning won't be as carefully controlled as a prescribed fire, but if you can get 75, 80% of it burned within a range of tolerability, I think that may be the best we can hope for these days, because things are going to get worse before they get better.
Okay, and with that, we probably have time for one last question. We'll see, maybe two can fit in. But a question about the impact that invasives have had on the landscape and the impact they have had, and how can we address this concern?
Well, if I could answer that in a minute, I would, and I'd be famous. It's a wicked problem, as the scientists put it. It's in some ways an insoluble problem in that there's no fix. I think there are a variety of things you can do to learn to live with it. And that's probably the best we're going to get. We're not going to eradicate some of these species, and even cheatgrass, the poster child for them all, is not the worst. There are a lot more noxious and viler species out there. And if you manage to control cheatgrass, you've got to make sure that something else doesn't replace it. That means reestablishing the perennials that were there first, and that gets you into all kinds of other issues. And unless we have a political system that allows us to reach consensus easier than what we've got now, I don't see that happening. It's not a future I like. I mean, I've got grandkids. I quit teaching because ASU's youngest students were the age of my oldest grandkid. So I may have great grandkids before I'm through. So I don't know what to tell them about that. This is again, this is another case of between two fires. We can't look for, it's not, living landscapes are not cities. We don't control it in the same way. We will have fires, and we will have to thread between them.
So I think we have time for one last question, and I know Carrie wanted to close things out, but I know we have a number of EPA and air quality regulators registered, at least, for this, and you know, sometimes we try to use the historical perspective of, you know, the blues, you know, were covered with smoke, and in part that's why they're called the blues, and that sort of thing. How can we use this historical level of burning to negotiate with air quality regulators in regards to burning and smoke in the air?
That's another great question. And part of the difficulty is knowing what historical period do you want to use as your point of reference. Certainly in the 19th century, when we start getting reports, the Willamette Valley, you know, is smothered in smoke for extended periods, and other valleys throughout the Northwest are as well. And it's hard to know how much of this was an acceleration due to settlement and land clearing and burning, and how much of it is a continuation. So instead of traditional burning in the mountains, how much of it is going for, say, sheep and transhuman pastoralism, moving up and down. So we've taken as a standard a kind of artificial time, really the post-war period, where smoke had disappeared largely for a variety of reasons, except for burning fields in the Willamette Valley and slash on the west side. But that could be controlled. Those were things we did. And it's given us an expectation that the air should be clear all the time, where historically it was not. So this may be another case where history doesn't tell us what we should do. It tells us how to think about behaving, how to move into an uncertain future, and be smart about it. Well,
appreciate that. And Steve, definitely appreciate your time today and putting this together. And And also would like to thank the Northwest Fire Science Consortium and Carrie and Autumn, and then we had our state and regional office fire ecologist work on setting this up. So a lot of people were involved behind this, and you know, do appreciate everybody checking in. It looked like at one point in time we had a little over 200 folks from various agencies, not just Forest Service and BLM, but EPA, local air quality agencies, NGOs, industry.
Well, thank you. It was a great opportunity. I appreciate the chance.
Yeah, and just I want to give a shout out here from the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. Steve, we really appreciate your time coming to talk to us on this webinar, and then also everybody else's time. Like Brad said, there's over 200 people online with us that you would share your time with us. And you might see on your screen, I put up a poll, and if you wouldn't mind taking very quickly, the poll isn't linked to your name or your email. It gives us information that provides us measures of impacts for this webinar. And so if you wouldn't take just a quick moment to fill that out, I would really appreciate that. And just before I lose you online here, I just want to give a quick announcement that if you aren't already aware, the Joint Fire Science Program has announced its funding opportunities, and there are two. One is on performance of fuel breaks and fuel break systems, and the other is the Graduate Research Innovation, the GRIN Award. And so those proposals are due on December 5th, so get those in. And then finally, more webinars are coming down the pike this winter, so be sure to check out our website for those details, or better yet, sign up for our listserv and get automatic notifications about our webinars right into your email inbox. So with that, I know we missed some questions, and I apologize for that. Next time, I guess. Right, Steve, when you come on next time with your next book. No, but anyway, have a good rest of your day, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.